In the cold, sterile atmosphere of a courtroom, power dynamics often play out in subtle yet deeply psychological ways. But sometimes they explode into the overt and unforgettable. When a public figure like Karoline Leavitt becomes the target of a humiliating act, especially one so physically and symbolically degrading as having her head forcibly shaved, something deeper is at work than a mere legal dispute. It represents a calculated attempt to strip someone of their identity, pride, and dignity in front of the world, and the intention behind such an act often extends beyond punishment. It seeks submission. For someone as composed and defiant as Karoline, the very nature of that act planted a seed that would bloom not into shame, but into retribution. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must look beyond the surface and appreciate how much of a person's identity is tied to their appearance. Hair, particularly for a woman in the public eye, is not just about style or vanity. It is a symbol of control, femininity, and often the carefully curated image that supports her voice and influence. Shaving it away under the harsh light of public scrutiny wasn't just an act of discipline, it was a public erasure. And rather than being broken by it, Karoline chose to see it as a challenge, a fire lit beneath her. There is a visceral reaction that comes with that kind of humiliation. Some would shrink, withdraw, disappear into silence. But Karoline isn't wired that way. Instead of allowing the act to reduce her, she internalized it as fuel. It wasn't just about hair, it was about autonomy, defiance, and reclaiming control of the narrative. Every strand that fell to the courtroom floor ignited something deeper. A storm gathering behind calm eyes, a plan quietly forming behind, a bowed head. The humiliation became the starting point of a new agenda. Public reaction plays a role in any highly visible event, and this one was no different. Spectators, critics, and supporters alike watched the footage with shock and disbelief. There were gasps, there was outrage, and yet there was also curiosity. How would she respond? Would this end her career? Her image? Would it make her more vulnerable or more dangerous? She didn't answer those questions with words, not at first. She let silence speak for her while her eyes burned with intent, the kind of silence that doesn't indicate defeat, but the stillness before movement, before eruption. What came next wasn't loud or chaotic, but it was ruthless in its precision. Instead of emotional retaliation or public outbursts, she played a longer game. She showed up, shaved head and all, not with shame, but with sharpened presence. Her speeches carried more weight, her movements more purpose. The vulnerability of her appearance made her more dangerous, not less. It disarmed people, challenged their expectations, and forced them to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about her. In a space where perception is everything, she made hers a weapon. There's something poetic in the way she turned the experience into an asset. No longer defined by how she looked, she became more focused, more unpredictable. Her actions took on a quiet edge. She disrupted the comfort of those who thought they had seen the worst of her. They had misunderstood the nature of her resilience. She didn't need to fight with fists or fury. She used strategy. She learned, adapted, and recalibrated. And behind each move was the memory of that moment, not as a scar, but as a landmark. A reminder that the lowest point wasn't where she broke, it was where she began. In this transformation, she refused to be a victim of spectacle. She turned it into theater of her own making. She understood that revenge wasn't just about returning fire, it was about reclaiming power on her terms. She didn't mirror the cruelty, she surpassed it, with intent, with elegance edged in steel. Ruthlessness, when paired with clarity and control, becomes a kind of art. It's not about loud declarations or explosive reactions. It's about execution with precision and timing. When Karoline Leavitt began crafting her response to the ordeal she had endured, it wasn't reactionary or born from chaos. It was cold, calculated, and unnervingly elegant. She wasn't interested in merely proving a point. She was interested in altering the entire dynamic of power. What looked, on the surface, like vengeance was actually something more layered. It was a reclamation, not only of her autonomy, but of the structures that had been weaponized against her. Her approach didn't begin with threats or warnings. There were no public outcries, no sob stories, no messy emotions spilled across press conferences. She knew that silence held more power than noise, and she wielded it with surgical skill. As her opponents waited for a breakdown or a desperate plea, what they got instead was composure. That composure unnerved them far more than fury ever could. Because in that silence was the promise of intent. She wasn't going to fight on their terms. She was going to build her own battleground. The brilliance of her strategy was in its subtlety. She understood that revenge isn't always about a singular act. Sometimes it's a slow burn, a series of moves that look harmless in isolation, but devastating when viewed in totality. Her public appearances became sharper, more deliberate. Her statements brief but potent. Every word was chosen with care, every silence just as loud as her voice. She made no apologies for what she had become in the aftermath, nor did she ask for sympathy. What she projected instead was clarity, a rare, almost unsettling focus that made it clear she had shed more than just hair in that courtroom. She had shed fear. It wasn't long before those who had dismissed her as humiliated or broken realized they had misjudged her entirely. Her network grew stronger. Quiet alliances were formed. She moved through halls of power like a shadow, not seeking attention, but commanding it anyway. When people spoke her name, it was with a new tone, one laced with caution and curiosity. What was she planning? When would she strike? No one knew for sure, and that uncertainty gave her an edge sharper than any blade. Her ruthlessness wasn't vindictive. It was methodical. She never targeted arbitrarily, never lashed out indiscriminately. Instead, she focused on pressure points. She understood systems, understood how influence flowed, and she made subtle shifts in the current until she could redirect it entirely. She didn't need to destroy to win, she needed to outmaneuver. And she did again and again, until those who once held leverage found themselves disarmed by someone they had underestimated. In this transformation, she did something rare. She redefined the parameters of power in her space. No longer operating under the rules set by others, she established her own terms. Those who crossed her didn't face loud retaliation, they faced erasure, quiet but complete. Careers faltered. Positions shifted. Narratives changed, all without a single visible outburst. Her style of revenge didn't look like punishment. It looked like progress, like inevitability, and that's what made it so effective. Even those who once distanced themselves from her began to lean in, intrigued by her resilience and perhaps a little fearful of her potential. She wasn't the same woman they had known before. Something in her had crystallized, something cold and unyielding but strangely magnetic. She moved through rooms not as a survivor, but as a force, unbothered, unafraid, and utterly relentless. Her presence alone shifted dynamics. And in the world she was shaping, it became clear. You could either align with her or prepare to be left behind. In her hands, revenge became more than retribution. It became evolution. It was not about reliving the pain, but about using it as a compass. It pointed not backward to where she had been wronged, but forward to where she would now. Public perception is a living, breathing force. It changes shape depending on what it's fed, sometimes by media, sometimes by silence, sometimes by raw, undeniable presence. In Karoline Leavitt's case, her experience in that courtroom could have easily marked the end of her public credibility. The act she endured was meant to define her, to mark her as weak, shamed, and outplayed. But what it did instead was ignite an unexpected reaction in the people watching. They weren't just witnessing a dramatic scene, they were watching someone reforge herself in real time, and that captured their attention in a way that couldn't be ignored. People are drawn to authenticity, especially in moments where strength seems least expected. As Karoline emerged from the storm, she did so without flinching, without retreating, and without masking the rawness of her experience. The image of her with a shaved head became more than a headline. It became a symbol of grit. The world had seen her at what should have been her lowest, and yet she carried herself with a level of poise that reframed the entire event. What was meant to be a spectacle of submission turned into a moment of declaration. This transformation didn't require words. In fact, it was her restraint that spoke the loudest. Every appearance she made afterward challenged the narrative others tried to assign to her. She didn't defend herself, didn't explain away the event, didn't wallow or beg for redemption. Instead, she embraced the discomfort and weaponized it. The public, in turn, started seeing her not as someone who had been diminished, but as someone who had survived fire and came out sharper. Curiosity turned into admiration, and admiration into support. It wasn't pity she inspired, it was respect. That respect grew quietly at first. Whispers of her strength circulated through social media, think pieces, and conversations around power dynamics. People who had never aligned with her before found themselves rethinking their positions. Something about the way she handled herself made it impossible to dismiss her. And as those conversations grew, so did her influence. Not because she asked for it, but because she embodied it. She had become a reflection of resilience, and that resonated far beyond her typical circles. Her ability to shift perception so effortlessly wasn't accidental. It came from a deep understanding of human nature. She knew that most people are looking for something to believe in, especially someone who can rise after being broken. She became that figure not by design, but by instinct. Her instincts told her that people didn't want perfection. They wanted perseverance. They wanted to see someone stripped bare and still standing, and that's exactly what she gave them. Media. Outlets began changing their tone. Early coverage that had focused on scandal began shifting toward analysis of her stoicism. Photos once meant to mock her became portraits of resolve. She didn't need to orchestrate a campaign to change the public's mind. She just had to keep showing up, present, unapologetic, and unshaken. That constancy began to rewrite the story others had tried to script for her. She became a symbol not of defeat, but of control reclaimed. Supporters started multiplying. People who had once doubted her capabilities now saw her as someone who had endured the worst and come out bolder. Her speeches started drawing larger crowds. Invitations to speak, lead, and represent came pouring in. What had initially been a stain on her public image had somehow transformed into a badge of honor. Not because the act itself was honorable, but because of how she refused to be defined by it. Even critics found themselves hesitant. How do you attack someone who has already been so publicly torn down and stood back up? The usual tactics didn't land the same. Accusations lost their sting. Attempts to frame her as unstable or vindictive failed to gain traction. Her calm dismantled every whisper of fragility. She had altered the public's emotional investment in her. They were no longer passive observers. They were witnesses to a reinvention. She never asked to become a symbol of resilience, but when that moment came, she embraced it fully. Her every move began to carry the weight of someone who had not only survived injustice, but reshaped it into influence. People looked at her and saw not just a politician, not just a speaker, but a figure who had absorbed fire and come back for it. Public perception had shifted not because of what she said, but because of what she represented, the ability to rise uninvited and unapologetic. The transformation she underwent didn't stop at image or influence. It went deeper, reaching into the very way she operated in the world. The events that sought to undo her instead became the crucible in which a new version of her was formed. Sharper, colder, more calculating. It wasn't rage that defined her afterward. It was clarity. What she learned through pain and humiliation wasn't just how to endure. It was how to read power, manipulate systems, and move in silence. Every room she entered after that was entered differently. She no longer walked in as someone seeking a seat at the table. She walked in knowing how to flip the table entirely if needed. She didn't announce this change. There was no speech declaring her reinvention. The change revealed itself in her choices, measured, strategic, and often unexpected. Her plans, once transparent to colleagues and opponents alike, became opaque. She learned to guard her movements, to veil her intentions, to speak only when the silence no longer served her. The predictability that others had once used to disarm her vanished. In its place was someone far more dangerous, someone who no longer reacted, but anticipated. Those around her began to notice the difference. Where once she may have been questioned or underestimated, now there was hesitation. People chose their words more carefully in her presence. The same circles that once whispered behind her back now watched her closely, unsure whether to fear her or follow her. And she didn't rush to clarify. She let the discomfort settle, let the tension build. She understood now the strength in patience, in letting others show their cards first. Her restraint became her weapon, her silence a strategy, and her unpredictability a shield. She built her moves like a chess player several steps ahead. Small, unassuming changes started to reshape her environment. She replaced key staff. She shifted alliances. She declined offers that once would have been considered golden because she saw past the glitter to the traps beneath. Every decision was made with precision, each one leading toward a larger plan only she fully understood. And that kind of autonomy, one rooted in earned wisdom, became the foundation of her new power. There was no need for revenge in the traditional sense. Her very existence, thriving against expectation, became its own quiet form of reckoning. Those who had positioned themselves against her began to find themselves edged out, not with confrontation, but with indifference. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. Her actions spoke louder than any public feud ever could. Influence became a current she could redirect at will, and she no longer needed to shout to be heard. The moment she entered a space, the tone changed. What she had learned through her experience was not just resilience, it was discipline. Emotional discipline, intellectual discipline. The ability to wait, to observe, to plan. The same qualities that had once made her vulnerable in the public eye, her visibility, her youth, her intensity, were now recalibrated into assets. She no longer apologized for her presence. She owned it, not with arrogance, but with absolute certainty. And it unnerved those who still operated on old assumptions. In private meetings, she no longer played defense. Her questions were sharper, her silence more pointed. She had learned how to make people speak just to fill the space she left empty. Her influence, once wielded through charisma alone, had now matured into something deeper, control born from experience. She had become someone who no longer needed the approval of institutions or individuals. Her authority was self-sustaining, rooted in what she had endured and what she had built from the ashes. This wasn't a story of someone getting even. It was a story of someone getting smart, getting strategic, and getting free. Every element of her growth served a purpose. The humility she had once offered so freely was now rare, reserved only for those who earned it. She wasn't cold. She was precise. She wasn't bitter. She was focused. And that focus made her untouchable in ways no title or public recognition ever could. Her reinvention wasn't for show. It was survival, evolution, and ultimately ascension. She had seen what the bottom looked like and had no interest in returning. Not because she feared it, but because she had already claimed everything it had to teach her. She carried those lessons forward, not as baggage, but as armor. And with that armor, she built something greater than just a comeback. She built dominance. What emerged from Karoline Leavitt's experience was not just a woman reshaped by adversity, but a force sharpened by it. Her journey wasn't marked by melodrama or spectacle, but by method. Each step she took following her public humiliation was deliberate, layered with intent, and free of impulsive emotion. She proved that endurance alone is not enough. What matters is what one becomes after the breaking point. And she chose to become something no one saw coming, controlled, compelling, and quietly unrelenting. Rather than be shattered by the moment designed to strip her power, she used it as a forge. The version of herself that walked into that courtroom might have been underestimated, but the one that walked out had nothing left to lose, and that made her dangerous. She had seen the worst, stood through it, and found a way to transform not only how others saw her, but how she saw herself. That shift in identity became the core of her strength moving forward. No longer concerned with appeasing or pleasing, she operated from a place of complete ownership over her decisions, her narrative, and her influence. She didn't need to scream to make her presence felt. Her silence carried a different kind of gravity. It unsettled those who once believed they held sway over her future. It made space for her to move differently, calm, quiet, strategic, and in that stillness, she found momentum. The more they waited for her to falter, the more they realized she wasn't operating by the old rules anymore. She was writing new ones on her terms. What sets her apart isn't just what she endured, but how she chose to grow from it. She refused to play the victim, refused to be a martyr, and instead became something far more powerful, a symbol of unshakable composure and tactical reinvention. Her story isn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It's about reclaiming identity. It's about knowing when to act, when to hold back, and when to let success speak louder than retaliation ever could. Karoline's resilience became a quiet revolution, not only against the act that was meant to break her, but against every assumption made about her in its aftermath. She didn't just survive, she transcended. And in doing so, she became untouchable. Not by force, not by fear, but by mastery. What began as an attempt to silence her ended up amplifying her voice in ways no one could have predicted. She didn't return to who she was. She evolved into someone far more formidable, and that is her ultimate answer to those who sought to define her limits.